Hey, and welcome to JavaScript date lesson, where we're going to take a closer look at what's available for date. Now, there's a lot of different ways to use JavaScript date. So let's take a closer look at some of the options we have available for date. And there's several ways to create the date object where you can set the current date. So if you just do new date, getting the date object, that's going to get the current date. You can also set the date object to a particular date. And there's a number of different ways that you can set the date object. So you can divide it up within the year, the month, the day, the hour, the minute, the second. So you can set it that way. Or as well, you can write it in a number of different ways. And this is all going to create that same date object, although the third one here is going to create it at a default time because we're not specifying the time of that date object. So let's see what else we can do with date. And there are a lot of things you can do with date. So the way that date works is that JavaScript creates a date instance that represents a single moment in time. We can take a closer look at that within the Mozilla Developer Network at the docs, where we've got several different examples of date. So date is written, and this is actually the same date. So there's more information as to how to use date, of course, down below. And there are a lot of things, including looking at the Unix timestamp, which is a representation of a number milliseconds since January 1st, 1970. And we can calculate out how many seconds since that time. As well, you can get the year, you can get the month, and this is zero based, so starting at 0, so January is 0, December is 11th. So keep that in mind when you are creating the dates, that when you are using month index, that this is zero based. There's also the day, so this is an integer representing the day, hours, minutes, seconds, and you can even go to milliseconds. And if you are getting the milliseconds, once again, it is based on that January 1st, 1970. And the date object range is 100 million, so negative 100 million to plus 100 million. And the good thing about the date object is it provides a uniform behavior across platforms. So if we use date now, it returns a numeric value corresponding to the current time minus the number of milliseconds that have elapsed since January 1st, 1970. And there's also more that you can do within the date prototype, where you can get the date as well as the day, the full year, the hours, the milliseconds from the date object. Once you can get something, you can also set it. So setting the date, setting the full year, setting the hours. So this gives you the ability to manipulate the date object. Shall we try it within the editor? So first of all, let's get our new date. So just using the new date method in order to set that date. And I'm going to output it into the console so we can see what is contained within date. So it provides a string value of the current date. There's also using the date object, and we can get now. So that returns back again those milliseconds. We can create a new date as well. So we can take date, so creating a new date object, and we can set the date. And then we saw there's a number of different ways to set it. So if we want to set it to 2020, and this is November. So keeping in mind zero based for the month. And we can set hours, we can set minutes, we can set seconds, we can even set milliseconds if we want. So we've got Sunday, November 15th, 2020. So that's the year, the month, the day, and so on. So that's the hours, the minutes, the seconds, and the milliseconds. And notice again, so if we go to 11, that sets it to December. If we do 12, then what happens is we end up with January. So January is 12, and it's also 0, but we're adding to the year, so we're just incrementing the date. So if you had a particular value, if you wanted to add to that date value, so if you had, let's say for instance, you had 11, and you want to return back and increase it by 1, you can always add 1 to the value, and that will increment and change the current date object that's being output. New date, you can also use the milliseconds as well, so setting date. And if you set it to 0, you're going to see that you're going to get that December 31st, 1969 at 7 p.m. because this is GTM time. So using that same date starting January 1st, 1970, and we can count up from there, number of milliseconds. We get 2001, and if we had another 0, and this is again milliseconds from that January 1st, 1970, so now we're at 2068 as the year. Then we can apply string methods to it and outputting it as a string. So it returns a date portion of a date object in human readable English. So Wednesday, April 3rd, 2019. So you see it converts it. And this is more used than the UTC string. And as we saw, there's a number of different ways to set the date. So if we want to take the dates and create a new date object from various formats. And this is really super useful because of the fact that we can utilize it from different input formats. So we see that this one, we can set the month as 12 and it comes back December because we're not using the zero based, we're using a string value in order to set the date. And we can use the dashes, we can use the slashes, and there's a number of other formats that can be used as a standard in order to output and create the dates. You can also get values from the dates. So if we do d equals, so the get date gets the day. So this is returning back the day. And I'm just going to move a few things around here. So I'm going to set up the val, as it's probably better to set val and then also using d. So it's getting the fourth day of the week. Date is getting the day, so the numeric value. And then get day is getting the day of the week. So this is a value from 0 to 6. And if we update it to 27, then we see it starts at 0. We can also get the time as well. So that's another option. So as mentioned, there's a ton of different options here. So the time, once again, is returning back that numeric timestamp. So that's milliseconds again. You can do value and d get milliseconds, so you can get the full year, you can get hours, you can get milliseconds. And because we didn't define any, it's set to 0, because this one is 0. Where we're setting the milliseconds, let me comment all of those out. We see that now we can see that we've got 30 for the milliseconds, and now we've got 40 for the milliseconds. We can also get minutes, get the month, get the seconds, get the time. And there's also one called time zone offset. So it returns the time zone offset from UTC in minutes for the current local time. So that's another useful one. Depending on where you're getting these date objects, you might want to use the local time or the UTC time. So if you get milliseconds in UTC, it's actually going to be the same because that's not being affected. The one that's actually being affected is the hours. So if we get hours and then UTC hours, you're going to see that there is a difference between get hours and UTC hours. So UTC is 10 because that's getting it according to universal time. And then this one is local time. So what if we wanted to get the time of tomorrow? So the tomorrow's date. So let's set a parameter and we'll make it dynamic. So set days 1 and we can adjust this. And then using const, we're going to get a new date and equal that to new date object. And we need to set the date. So we want to get the tomorrow's date. So taking date, using now so that this returns back the milliseconds. We're going to add it. And what we're adding is days, but we need to multiply it to get the right milliseconds. So there's 24 hours in a day. There's 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, and 1,000 milliseconds in every second. So now we can get the new date is going to contain tomorrow's date. So you can see it being output there, that April 4th, and today is April 3rd. So you can try this one and we can adjust this as needed. So like if I set it to 0 days, then it's going to return back today's day. If I do 10 days, then it's going to do 10 days from now. And if I do 100 days, we're going to see it's going to do 100 days as well. So this is a more accurate way of setting the date instead of incrementing each day, because as we saw, whenever you increment the days, sometimes things get thrown off. So you don't always have that each week is going to be 7 because you might be at the end of the month or at the beginning of the month. So things might change. And there's an example within the guide for this, how to add a day. And then also what you can do is you can try to add a week as well using the same format. So there is a challenge for this lesson. And the challenge is to get the number of milliseconds since January 1st, 1970 to your birthday, and then output that into the console. And I've got an example of the code. So you can pause the video, and of course you're going to get different birthday than me, unless you're born at the exact same time, and then get the milliseconds into the console. So go ahead and try this out. And the code is just down here below.